It started with the sound of heavy machinery in the driveway. That deep, grinding rumble you can feel in your chest before you even see where it's coming from. I stepped outside, still half awake, coffee in hand, and there it was, a bright yellow bulldozer crawling up toward my sister's front yard. For a second, I thought maybe it was some kind of road repair project. But then I saw the logo on the side of the truck that followed it. HOA Property Services. At first, my brain didn't connect the dots. Why would the HOA need a bulldozer here? But then, as the driver shifted gears and lined up along the curb, my eyes landed on the one thing that made my stomach drop: my sister's wheelchair ramp. The one we'd spent weeks installing. The one she depended on every single day to leave her house without help. My sister was inside, probably at her desk working. She has a lot on her plate. She's a state governor, and her days are packed with calls, meetings, and the endless stream of paperwork that comes with running an entire state. But here's the thing, that's not how most people see her. To the HOA, she was just another homeowner. Another name on their endless list of people to keep in line. I walked down the steps toward the workers. The bulldozer operator was already glancing at the ramp, pointing toward it like it was some kind of hazard to be cleared away. Behind him, a woman in a pressed beige suit, clipboard in hand, dark sunglasses hiding her eyes, was barking orders like she was running a military operation. I knew exactly who she was. Karen. HOA president. The kind of person who gets a strange thrill out of enforcing rules that don't even make sense. "What's going on here?" I called out. My voice was steady, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. Karen didn't even turn toward me right away. She was too busy telling the bulldozer operator where to position the blade. Finally, she looked over her shoulder and said, "We're removing an unapproved structure. This ramp was built without HOA authorization." I blinked at her. "You mean the wheelchair ramp?" She shrugged like it didn't matter. "It doesn't comply with our architectural guidelines. The owner's been notified. We have the right to remove it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't a mailbox they didn't like. This wasn't a flower bed that didn't match their precious aesthetic standards. This was medical accessibility. This was the only way my sister could leave her house without someone physically lifting her chair down the steps. "Do you realize this is a violation of federal law?" I said, taking a step closer. "You can't just tear out a wheelchair ramp because it doesn't match your design rules. The Americans with Disabilities Act exists for a reason." Karen's lips tightened. "We operate under our own bylaws, not whatever you think applies here." That was all I needed to hear to understand exactly what kind of battle this was going to be. I glanced toward the house. My sister had come to the door, her wheelchair positioned just behind the screen. She was watching quietly, her eyes fixed on the bulldozer like she was memorizing every detail. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The anger in her eyes said more than words ever could. Karen turned back to her clipboard, clearly ready to proceed. The bulldozer engine roared a little louder. My coffee cup felt heavy in my hand. This wasn't just some petty HOA dispute anymore. This was an attack on my sister's independence. And they were doing it right in front of her, like they didn't care what it meant or who they were dealing with. I stepped in front of the bulldozer. "Not 1 inch closer," I said. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Sir, if you interfere with our work, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." I almost laughed. If she wanted law enforcement, fine. She had no idea the kind of legal storm she was walking into. Because what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman inside that house wasn't just another homeowner. She wasn't just my sister. She was the sitting governor of this state. And she had the power to control every cent of state funding that touched this HOA's world. The bulldozer operator hesitated, looking between us. The rumble of the engine was the only sound in the air. I could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, the difference between them backing off or making the worst mistake of their lives. And from the look in Karen's eyes, I could tell she had no idea which one it was about to be. The bulldozer's engine growled louder, a low mechanical snarl that vibrated through the ground. The operator glanced at Karen again, waiting for the nod. She gave it with a quick flick of her hand, like she was swatting away a fly. And just like that, the metal beast lurched forward. The blade scraped against the edge of the driveway, inching toward the ramp. I stepped back just enough to avoid being hit but stayed close, my eyes locked on the operator. "You don't want to do this," I told him. His face stayed neutral, but I could see the hesitation there. Karen's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Keep going. You're authorized. Ignore him." The crunch of gravel under the bulldozer's tracks was deafening. My sister sat at the doorway, gripping the armrest of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak, but I knew what she was feeling. This wasn't just property damage, it was humiliation. It was someone standing in front of her home saying, "Your needs don't matter here." The blade reached the bottom edge of the ramp. With a shove of the controls, the operator lifted it slightly, ready to wedge under and pry it loose. My heart pounded hard enough to hear in my ears. "Stop," I said again, louder this time. "You're about to break federal law." Karen smirked. "This isn't Washington, D.C. This is private property with our own rules." That was it. No more pretending they didn't know better. No more excuses about aesthetic guidelines or unapproved modifications. This was willful ignorance wrapped in arrogance. The metal bit into the wood with a splintering crack. Pieces of the ramp's lower boards popped loose, skittering across the driveway. My sister flinched but didn't look away. If they thought they could intimidate her, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Karen stood with her clipboard like she was overseeing a construction project, not destroying something that gave a disabled person independence. She didn't even glance at my sister, just watched the work like it was routine. I pulled out my phone. "You're on video," I told her. "Every second of this." Her sunglasses shifted slightly, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in her posture. But she recovered fast, turning back to the bulldozer. "Finish it." The machine roared again, pushing forward with enough force to lift the entire ramp an inch before dropping it with a loud thud. More boards cracked, nails screeched free from their places. In less than a minute, weeks of work, the careful measurements, the strong railings, the smooth incline that made my sister's life easier, was reduced to jagged rubble. When the last piece fell away, the operator backed up slowly, his eyes darting between me and Karen. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Karen finally turned to me, her lips curling into the faintest hint of satisfaction. "There," she said. "Violation removed. You're welcome." I stared at her, silent for a moment. My sister's gaze was on me now, waiting. And that's when I felt it, the shift. The moment the game changed. Because up until now, Karen thought she was holding the power here. She thought she could walk onto anyone's property and enforce her version of order without consequence. I leaned in just enough for my voice to be calm but clear. "You just made the worst mistake of your career." Karen tilted her head like she was bored. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," I said. "And you'll find out exactly why soon." I didn't have to explain it. Not yet. Because when the time came, the reveal would hit harder than anything I could say in that moment. I turned toward my sister. Her jaw was set, her eyes sharp. She gave the smallest nod, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. This wasn't just about replacing a ramp anymore. This was about making sure no one in this HOA ever thought they could do this to anyone again. Karen didn't know who she was standing across from. She didn't know the level of authority my sister held, or how deep her reach went into the funding streams that kept this entire HOA afloat. But she was about to. And when that truth landed, it would be louder than any bulldozer they could bring. The street was quiet after the bulldozer left, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It was the kind that hangs heavy in the air, like the pause before a thunderstorm. Pieces of broken ramp lay scattered across the driveway. Splintered boards, bent nails, chunks of concrete from where the posts had been anchored. My sister didn't say a word as I wheeled her outside. She looked over the mess slowly, her eyes sharp, her lips pressed into a tight line. If Karen thought she'd just silenced her, she couldn't have been more wrong. She pulled out her phone. Not to call the police, not yet. That would come later. First, she scrolled to a number she knew by heart. When the person on the other end answered, her tone was cool but firm. "This is Governor Reynolds. I need the ADA compliance office on the line immediately." The call was short, direct, and carried the kind of authority that made people move fast. Within minutes, she had the state's Americans with Disabilities Act enforcement director looped in. She laid out exactly what happened. An HOA ordering the destruction of a wheelchair ramp without any legal process, ignoring federal accessibility laws. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. By the time she hung up, the wheels of enforcement were already turning. A formal complaint was being drafted. Compliance officers were on standby to visit the site. And that was just the first call. Next, she dialed her chief of staff. "I want a meeting with the Housing and Urban Development Liaison this afternoon," she said. "Yesterday. We're discussing state funding requirements for community associations. And yes, this is related to a specific incident." She didn't have to spell it out. Her team knew exactly what it meant when she made that kind of request. Community associations, like HOAs, often depended on state-managed grants, infrastructure funding, and compliance approvals. All of it could be delayed, reduced, or scrutinized if they failed to meet basic legal obligations. While she worked the political angle, I handled the evidence. I walked the property, photographing every broken piece of the ramp, every mark the bulldozer tracks left in the driveway, every bit of damage that could be tied directly to their actions. I kept my voice notes going as I recorded the timeline, who was present, what was said, and when the destruction happened. Neighbors started to trickle over, curiosity pulling them from their porches. A few asked what had happened. When they heard, some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered about how Karen had finally gone too far. One man leaned in and said quietly, "She's been itching to make an example out of someone. Guess she picked the wrong person." Inside, my sister was still making calls. I could hear her through the open window, her tone steady and professional as she spoke to the State Attorney General's office. "I'm requesting a review of potential civil rights violations under federal and state law," she said. "Yes, I'll be filing it personally. And yes, I have video." Karen had no idea this was happening. As far as she knew, she'd driven off victorious, another unauthorized structure removed. She had no clue that by the time she poured her second cup of coffee, the state's highest offices would be looking into her little operation. And my sister wasn't done yet. She had one more call to make, to a local news station. She didn't ask them to cover the story. She told them they should. "A disabled homeowner had her only access ramp destroyed by her HOA," she said. "You'll want to see the footage." The reporter's tone shifted instantly. "We'll send a crew." The thing about my sister was that she never needed to shout to be heard. She didn't need to bang on tables or wave her title around. All she had to do was make the right calls to the right people, and suddenly the problem was no longer just hers. It belonged to every agency, every office, every set of eyes that now had a reason to dig into what the HOA was really doing. And when those people started digging, they wouldn't just find a bulldozer incident. They'd find every overreach, every violation, every petty abuse of power that had been hiding under their neat suburban image. Karen thought she'd removed a ramp. She had actually just opened the door to a full-blown state investigation. The air outside felt heavier now. Not because of the heat, but because I knew what was coming. My sister was in motion. And once she started, nothing, not even an HOA president with a bulldozer, could stop her. Karen probably thought the day after the ramp demolition would be business as usual. She showed up to the HOA office in that same beige suit, clipboard tucked under her arm, ready to run through her morning checklist like nothing had happened. But the universe was already shifting under her feet, and she didn't even know it yet. The first crack came in the form of a phone call. Not from me. Not from my sister. From the state ADA compliance office. They didn't ask politely. They demanded records. Every communication, every approval, every so-called violation notice tied to my sister's property. They wanted it all, and they wanted it immediately. Karen's tone shifted from cheerful to clipped as she asked, "What's this in reference to?" The official on the other end didn't mince words. "We're investigating a potential violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. You are required by law to cooperate." By mid-morning, she'd been hit with a second call, this time from a state housing oversight committee. They wanted to schedule an in-person meeting to discuss the HOA's compliance with state-funded programs. Karen scribbled something on her clipboard, but her hand was shaking. I can only imagine her face when she checked her inbox. Email after email from agencies she'd probably never even heard of. Requests for documents. Requests for meeting times. Formal notices reminding her that non-compliance could result in penalties, lawsuits, or loss of funding. By noon, the HOA board members were whispering among themselves. One of them forwarded her an article from the local news station's website, the headline in bold letters, "State Governor's Wheelchair Ramp Demolished by HOA Bulldozer." Right beneath it, a photo of the broken ramp and a screenshot from my phone's video. That was the moment the room went cold. They knew the governor's name. They knew she lived in their community. But they hadn't connected the dots until now. Karen called an emergency board meeting. She tried to keep her voice steady as she said, "We need to discuss a public response." But the other members weren't as calm. One of them asked flatly, "Do you understand what you've done? She controls the funding for half our community projects." Another board member chimed in, "This isn't a parking violation, Karen. This is an ADA case. We could be looking at lawsuits, or worse." Karen waved them off. "We followed our bylaws. That's all that matters." But even she didn't sound convinced anymore. While they were scrambling behind closed doors, the state machine kept moving. Compliance officers visited the property that afternoon. They photographed the damage, measured the slope of the driveway, and collected my video footage. They interviewed my sister, who calmly explained the timeline without a hint of emotion. One of the officers pulled me aside. "This isn't going to be pretty for them," he said quietly. "It's not just the ramp. It's the way they went about it. No notice, no accommodation, no due process. That's a textbook ADA violation." That evening another blow landed. A memo from the governor's office, my sister's office, was sent to the state's funding review board. It advised a temporary hold on all discretionary funding to community associations pending compliance review. That included this HOA. The whispers in the neighborhood turned into full-blown conversations on driveways and porches. People were asking each other, "Did you hear? They might lose all their grant money." One neighbor said, "Karen's in way over her head." By the next morning, Karen's phone was ringing non-stop. Some calls were from angry board members demanding answers. Others were from residents furious that their HOA fees might go up if funding dried up. She tried to keep her usual sharp, authoritative tone, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. Her voice was thinner, quicker, as if she could talk fast enough to outrun the truth that was catching up to her. What she didn't realize, not yet, was that this wasn't just a bad week. It was the start of a collapse. My sister had set the wheels in motion, and every hour brought Karen one step closer to a fallout she couldn't control. And somewhere deep down, I think she was starting to feel it. That creeping sense that no matter how many rules she quoted, no matter how many clipboards she carried, she had finally picked the wrong fight. By the end of the week, Karen couldn't ignore it anymore. The pressure was building, and the whispers in the neighborhood had turned into open conversations in front yards. People were talking about funding freezes, state investigations, and even possible lawsuits. For someone who thrived on control, this was her worst nightmare. So she decided to go on the offensive. If she could get ahead of the story, maybe she could spin it back in her favor. That Saturday morning, she called for a special HOA community meeting in the clubhouse. Every homeowner received an email and a printed flyer slipped under their door. The room was packed when I walked in with my sister. Residents sat in folding chairs, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Karen stood at the front behind a folding table, a stack of papers in front of her, a forced smile stretched across her face. She had traded her beige suit for something a little softer, a pale blue blouse, but the change in clothing couldn't hide the tension in her posture. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice sugary but tight. "I wanted to address the recent misunderstandings regarding the removal of an unapproved structure from one of our properties." I could feel the air in the room tighten. Misunderstandings wasn't going to cut it. She launched into a speech about protecting property values, maintaining uniformity, and following established guidelines. She made it sound like tearing out a wheelchair ramp was nothing more than repainting a fence the wrong color. My sister sat there silently, her wheelchair positioned front and center. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a challenge to every word Karen tried to smooth over. Karen flipped through her stack of papers. "According to our bylaws," she said, "all exterior modifications require prior approval from the architectural committee. This ramp was installed without such approval." From the back of the room someone spoke up. "Are you saying a wheelchair ramp needs approval? Even when it's required by federal law?" Karen's smile faltered. "Well, yes, but..." Another voice cut in, sharper this time. "Karen, you destroyed a disabled person's only access to their home. You think that's going to look good in court?" The room buzzed with murmurs. Karen tried to wave it down. "Let's not get emotional here. We're discussing rules, not feelings." That was it. My sister wheeled forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying across the room. "Karen, this isn't about feelings. This is about the law. The ADA exists to protect people like me from exactly what you did. And you didn't just violate it, you did it in the most public, aggressive way possible." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but my sister didn't give her the chance. "You bulldozed my ramp without notice. You trespassed on my property. You destroyed something I rely on every single day. And now you're facing the consequences." The silence that followed was heavy. You could feel every pair of eyes in that room locked on Karen. She tried to recover, but her words came out clipped. "We're confident our actions were within the HOA's authority." A man in the front row shook his head. "You're confident? Karen, the governor is sitting right there. She's the one you did this to. And she's the one who can cut off every bit of state funding this HOA gets." The color drained from Karen's face. It was clear she'd hoped to keep that detail quiet. But now, every homeowner in the room knew exactly who my sister was, and exactly how much power she had to make life very, very hard for Karen and her board. The questions started flying. Is this why the news trucks were here? Are we really under state investigation? What's going to happen to our grants? Karen's answers grew shorter and more defensive. We're cooperating fully. It's being handled. There's no cause for alarm. But no one in that room believed her anymore. When the meeting finally broke up, clusters of residents lingered in the parking lot, talking in low, urgent tones. I overheard one woman say, "She's done. There's no coming back from this." Karen stayed inside, packing her papers slowly, her hands shaking just enough to notice. She didn't look up as we passed her table. My sister leaned in just slightly and said, "You wanted to make an example out of someone, Karen? Congratulations. You did." And with that, we left, the room buzzing behind us, the walls of Karen's authority crumbling a little more with every whispered conversation. 2 days after the community meeting, the first real hammer dropped. It didn't come quietly. It came in the form of a thick, official-looking envelope delivered by certified mail straight to the HOA office. The bold state seal on the front left no room for doubt. This was from the governor's office. Karen was inside when the delivery came. The receptionist signed for it, handed it over, and within seconds you could see the tension creep into her face. She didn't even open it right away. She just stared at it for a moment like maybe she could will it into disappearing. But it didn't disappear. It was real and she knew it. When she finally slid it open, the color drained from her cheeks. Inside was a formal notice. The HOA was now officially under state investigation for violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, property destruction, and potential misuse of authority. Attached was a list of immediate demands. Every policy, every complaint log, every architectural review decision for the last 5 years was to be turned over within 10 business days. And it didn't stop there. The letter also confirmed something that sent a ripple of panic through the entire board. Effective immediately, all state-managed grants and infrastructure funding allocated to the HOA were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. That meant no money for their landscaping contracts. No money for their community maintenance. No money for the shiny little projects they liked to brag about in newsletters. By mid-morning, the fallout began. Contractors started calling, saying they'd heard about the funding freeze and were putting work on hold until payment was guaranteed. Vendors were asking for updated contracts or upfront deposits before delivering any more services. The HOA's carefully polished image was already starting to crack. Karen called an emergency board meeting. This one wasn't public. No residents. No curious neighbors. Just the board members and a very frantic Karen. Voices rose behind the closed doors. One member shouted, "You've put us in financial jeopardy." Another hissed, "You went after the governor. What did you think was going to happen?" Karen tried to defend herself. "I was following procedure. Our bylaws." "Your bylaws don't trump federal law," someone snapped back. "You should have known that before you sent a bulldozer onto her property." Meanwhile, my sister was calmly moving forward on her side. The investigation team she'd set in motion had already sent compliance officers back to the neighborhood. They weren't just looking at the ramp demolition anymore. They were reviewing everything: boundary disputes, fines, enforcement actions, and any pattern of discrimination they could find. Neighbors began sharing their own stories, quietly at first, then more openly. One man admitted the HOA had fined him for having a ramp leading into his workshop because it didn't match community style. A single mother said she was threatened with liens over a small vegetable garden in her front yard. The stories piled up, and each one was another nail in the coffin of Karen's credibility. Local news crews returned for follow-up coverage. They filmed the damaged ramp still sitting in my sister's driveway, interviewed residents, and aired footage of Karen hurrying into her car without answering questions. The narrative wasn't just about one bad decision anymore. It was about a pattern of abuse, arrogance, and disregard for the law. By the end of the week, the HOA's inbox was flooded, not with architectural requests or routine inquiries, but with demands from residents to hold a recall vote. Petition sheets were circulating. People who'd been afraid to speak up before were suddenly finding their voices. The bulldozer incident had done what years of quiet frustration hadn't. It united the community against Karen. Inside the HOA office, the atmosphere was suffocating. The phones rang constantly, residents demanding answers, reporters asking for statements, agencies confirming deadlines for document production. Karen's usual clipped confidence was gone, replaced with a sharp-edged defensiveness. She was still trying to keep control, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. And through it all, My sister didn't need to raise her voice or make dramatic public statements. She didn't have to storm into meetings or trade insults. She just kept the wheels of the system turning, slow, steady, and unstoppable. The investigation was no longer a threat. It was a reality. And the first blow had already landed hard enough to shake the foundation of the entire HOA. Karen might have thought she could bulldoze her way through this. But now, for the first time, she was realizing that some walls can't be knocked down with heavy machinery, especially when they're made of law, power, and the truth. The investigation team didn't waste time. Within days, they were sitting in living rooms, flipping through dusty filing cabinets, and scanning every enforcement letter the HOA had sent in the last decade. At first, it looked like they were just collecting routine evidence. But then the real stories started to come out, the kind of stories that don't just hurt reputations, they destroy them. One neighbor, a retired veteran, pulled out a stack of faded letters. He'd been fined for flying the state flag on his porch. Not the national flag, the state flag. The letter claimed it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. The investigator's pen froze mid-note. Another resident, a widow in her 70s, explained how she'd been forced to remove a small ramp for her elderly mother because it lowered curb appeal. She'd replaced it with a temporary metal one that was unsafe and wobbled every time her mother used it. When she begged for a compromise, Karen's reply had been one cold sentence: rules are rules. Then there was the young couple who had been fined for having a child's playset in their backyard, because the bright colors were too distracting from the natural landscape. The fine had been steep enough that they had to sell the playset just to pay it off. Every story was another crack in the wall Karen had built around her power. And the investigators were writing down every word. In the HOA office, things were unraveling fast. The compliance officers requested security camera footage from the day of my sister's ramp demolition. Karen hesitated, saying the footage had already been overwritten. That answer didn't sit well. An investigator raised an eyebrow and asked for the maintenance logs proving the overwrite schedule. Karen suddenly had a lot less to say. Meanwhile, I kept feeding the investigators with everything I had. Photos, videos, copies of every letter my sister had received, witness names, dates, even timestamps of phone calls. Each piece of evidence connected another dot in the pattern the HOA had been hiding for years. The news coverage was relentless now. Headlines went from governor's ramp demolished to state investigation expands into HOA misconduct. Reporters started knocking on doors, asking residents for their own experiences. And they got them in detail. The public opinion was shifting hard. What had started as sympathy for my sister was turning into outrage at how the HOA had treated all its residents. Local talk radio stations aired call-in segments where people shared their own HOA horror stories. It wasn't just our community talking anymore. People from other towns were calling in to say, "This is exactly why we don't trust HOAs." Inside the board, panic was setting in. Karen tried to hold strategy sessions, but half the board members were barely showing up. One finally quit outright, sending an email to every homeowner explaining that they couldn't stand by and defend actions that violate basic human decency. The funding freeze was biting hard now. Landscaping crews stopped coming. The clubhouse pool sat closed because no one had paid for maintenance. Residents started complaining about weeds, potholes, and broken lights. The glossy image Karen had always projected, perfect lawns, clean streets, orderly fences, was falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. Through it all, my sister stayed calm. She never gloated. She never took public swipes at Karen. She just let the system work. Every time the investigators came back, she answered their questions clearly and handed over whatever they asked for. She knew patience was her best weapon. One afternoon, an investigator stopped by again. "We found something interesting," he said. "It's not just the ramp. We've uncovered multiple cases where the HOA enforced rules selectively. Some residents got fines for things others were allowed to do freely. And in a few cases, the enforcement seems personal." That word hung in the air. Personal. It meant discrimination. It meant targeting. And in the eyes of the law, that's not just bad behavior, that's dangerous territory. Karen must have felt it closing in because that same day she sent out a mass email to all residents. She called the investigation politically motivated and claimed it was an overreach of state authority. But instead of rallying support, it backfired. Dozens of residents hit reply all with their own horror stories. The chain email quickly turned into a public wall of grievances, all with her name attached. The damage was no longer just legal. It was social. Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping faster than she could hold it. And the more she tried to push back, the worse it got. The investigators weren't slowing down. They'd already hinted that their final report could recommend not just penalties, but complete restructuring of the HOA leadership. That meant Karen wouldn't just lose the fight over my sister's ramp, she could lose everything. And judging by the way the neighborhood was talking now, there wouldn't be many people lining up to save her. The official report landed like a thunderclap. It was thick, stamped with the state seal, and carried the weight of weeks of investigation. Copies went to the HOA board, the county clerk, and, thanks to a well-timed public records request, the local press. By the time the first headlines hit, the neighborhood was buzzing. State investigation finds pattern of discrimination in HOA. That was the lead story on the evening news, paired with video clips of my sister's demolished ramp and interviews with residents who'd finally decided to speak out. The report didn't just talk about my sister's case. It laid everything bare. Multiple documented ADA violations. Selective enforcement of rules. Targeting of certain residents with fines, threats, and property damage. Even financial mismanagement. Funds diverted for projects that mysteriously never happened. The language was blunt. The HOA has engaged in repeated, intentional acts that violate state and federal law. Karen couldn't spin this. She tried, sending out another mass email claiming the investigation was biased and that outside forces were trying to dismantle the HOA. But it fell flat. The report was public. Everyone could read for themselves exactly what she and her board had been doing. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. People crowded into the clubhouse, some holding copies of the report, others holding their phones with the news article pulled up. The air was hot with frustration. When Karen walked in, the murmurs rose like a wave. She tried to call the meeting to order, but the voices didn't quiet. A man in the second row stood up, holding the report in his hand. "You bulldozed a disabled woman's ramp," he said loudly, "and you think you can still sit up there and pretend nothing's wrong?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "Sir, you're out of order." "No, Karen," a woman interrupted from the back. "You're out of order. This whole board is." One after another, residents stood up. They weren't asking questions, they were making demands. "Resign. Step down now. We're calling a recall vote." Karen's jaw tightened. "There's a process for that and you'll have to follow it." "Oh, we will," someone shot back, "and this time the rules will work against you." The recall petition had already been circulating quietly for a week. Now it was everywhere, on kitchen counters, in front yards, even being signed in the parking lot outside the meeting. Neighbors who'd never spoken to each other before were walking door to door, collecting signatures. It wasn't just about my sister anymore. It was about years of pent-up anger finally finding a target. By the end of that week, nearly every household in the neighborhood had signed. People who had once been afraid to cross Karen were now openly defying her. They knew the report had destroyed whatever authority she thought she had left. The local news caught wind of the recall effort and covered it live. Cameras showed residents lining up to add their names to the petition. One woman looked straight into the camera and said, "She's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. We're taking it back." Karen kept trying to project control. She sent out carefully worded statements. She held short, awkward press briefings in front of the clubhouse. But the cracks were showing. She couldn't meet people's eyes anymore. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now had an edge of desperation. Meanwhile, my sister didn't have to do much at all. She wasn't leading the recall. She wasn't giving fiery speeches. She didn't need to. The community had taken up the fight for themselves. On the day the petition reached the required number of signatures, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People smiled at each other in passing. Cars slowed to wave. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense that the HOA's stranglehold might finally be loosening. Karen's name would be on the ballot. And judging by the mood, she wouldn't be keeping her seat for much longer. The ramp incident had started it, but by now, it had become something much bigger. A movement to take back the neighborhood from the woman who thought she could bulldoze her way through anyone who stood in her way. And from the look on Karen's face the next time I saw her, she finally understood just how badly she'd miscalculated. The recall vote day felt different from any other day in the neighborhood. People were out early, standing in small groups near the clubhouse, coffee cups in hand, talking in low, focused voices. It wasn't the usual HOA chatter about landscaping or parking. This was about change. Real change. Inside the clubhouse, the folding tables were lined up with sign-in sheets, clipboards, and a big, clear ballot box sitting right in the center. The HOA secretary sat at one end, checking off names as residents came in. There was no music, no light small talk, just the quiet shuffle of papers and the occasional scratch of pens as people marked their votes. Karen was there too, stationed at the front of the room like she was still in control. She wore her sharpest suit and that same tight smile she'd worn in every meeting for years. But her eyes told a different story. They darted around the room, scanning faces, trying to read the mood. And the mood wasn't in her favor. When my sister and I arrived, heads turned. People nodded to us, some whispering things like, "Thank you for standing up," and "It's time for her to go." My sister didn't say much. She just wheeled forward to the sign-in table, signed her name and took her ballot. The room seemed to pause for a moment as she dropped it into the box. Karen's gaze followed her, but there was no warmth in it. No attempt at reconciliation. Just a tight, almost defiant stare. She knew exactly who had set this chain of events in motion, even if she still refused to admit fault. Throughout the day, the steady flow of voters never slowed. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years were showing up. Young parents came with kids in tow. Retirees walked in with canes and walkers. It was like the entire neighborhood had decided that this wasn't just a formality, it was their chance to finally be heard. Some kept their heads down as they voted. Others made a point of meeting Karen's eye before slipping their ballots into the box. A few even whispered things to her, low enough that I couldn't hear, but judging by her stiffened posture, they weren't words of support. By late afternoon, the ballot box was nearly full. The atmosphere had shifted from tense to electric. People lingered outside in the cool shade, chatting about what might happen next. Nobody seemed to be talking about keeping Karen in her position. Not one person. When voting closed, the board members, minus Karen, carried the box to a side table to begin counting. A small crowd gathered at a respectful distance, pretending not to hover but clearly invested in every single ballot that came out. The sound of papers flipping and the occasional murmured number carried across the room. Karen stood a little apart from everyone, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her foot tapping fast against the floor. She tried to act as if she wasn't watching, but every time the counters announced a number, her head turned slightly. It didn't take long for the pattern to become obvious. One vote after another, the same name was marked, remove. The board didn't need to announce the running tally, you could see it in their faces. The outcome was a landslide. Finally, the HOA vice president cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. The results are in. The recall vote passes by an overwhelming majority. He paused, glancing at Karen. Effective immediately, Karen Reynolds is removed as HOA president. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a collective exhale like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for months and could finally let it out. Karen's expression hardened. She gathered her papers with sharp, quick motions and shoved them into her bag. Without looking at anyone, she said, "Fine. You'll regret this," and headed for the door. But no one followed her. No one tried to stop her. People just stood there, watching as she walked out of the clubhouse, heels clicking on the tile, shoulders stiff. The moment the door shut behind her, the room seemed to brighten. Neighbors began talking again, but now the conversations were lighter, even hopeful. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense that the HOA might start working for the community instead of against it. My sister didn't smile, but I could see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She hadn't needed to fight with Karen face to face. She'd simply let the truth speak for itself, and the community had done the rest. And as we walked back to her house, past the spot where her ramp had once stood, I couldn't help but think about how quickly power can crumble when people stop being afraid.